In this video, we're going to talk about how to get input from the console in Java. And the notes for this lecture can be found in two places. If you go to the CS365 website and go to Lecture Notes, you can find information about scanners in my Cliff Notes by scrolling down, and it has some very short stuff about scanner classes. You can also go and look at Java's tutorial on the scanner class. Finally, there is example code, and if you go to the one using a Java scanner, we will in fact be looking at that code as part of this lecture. So, what are the important things to know about console input in Java? And the very first thing is that you do have, just like you have system.out, you also have something called system.in. Unfortunately, you cannot read directly from system.in like you could write directly to system.out. Instead, you're going to have to wrap system.in in something called a scanner class. So a scanner class, what it does is it tokenizes the system.in stream. So for example, if I had a line that looked like Brad, 40, and true, then what the scanner does is it breaks it up by default based on white space into tokens, which you can then access. If you look at the Java documentation, it has ways to specify the delimiter using Perl-style regular expressions, but that's beyond the scope of this course. Typically, we'll show you a simple example just using the scanner class. So here I just created a very simple class called scan, and you can see here I wrapped system.in in a new scanner object. And now I'm saying while console has next int. So in this case, I am going to keep reading tokens, and I'm assuming they're ints, hence has next int. And I am going to store the next integer into age, and then I'm going to simply print it. And this just allows me to read a series of integer tokens and print them. So for example, if I run scan and I enter 20, let's say I enter 20, 30, 40, 50, you can see it just reads them one at a time. And note up here, very importantly, that I had to import the scanner class from a package called java.util. We'll talk about packages later in this course, but the import statement is a bit like # include statements in C and C++. They tell Java where to find library files. In this case, the scanner class is part of the java.util library. So the scanner class has a number of interesting methods. You've already seen a few of them that allow you to extract tokens. So if you just want to get a token, so we'll say token getting methods. There are ones like next, which returns a string. Next int, that returns, as you might guess, an int. Next double, that returns a double. Next Boolean, that will take in a Boolean as either true or false. You should actually write it out as true or false in your input. And there's one of these for each of the primitive types in Java. You can also check to see, so I'll call these checking functions, or checking methods, to check to see whether the next token actually is there and whether it fits the desired type. So you can say has next, and that will return true or false if there's a next token. So these are all Boolean. You can say has next int if you want to check to see not only is there a next token, but it can be converted to an integer. Has next double, which will say whether the next one can be converted to a double, and so on. And if you don't do that and you use one of these methods, the token getting methods, and it can't be converted, they throw an exception. Now it turns out that you do not have to catch this exception. It's what's called a runtime exception. And if it doesn't work, then you simply exit the program. So here we'll show you an example. I'm going to get rid of has next int. Instead, I'm just going to say while has next. And now I'm going to say next int and print it out. So let's go ahead and compile that and run it. And I'll enter 10, which is good. But now I'll try, say, 20 Brad, which can't be converted. And you can see that after it prints out 20, it threw an exception, input mismatch exception. We'll talk later in this course about how you can catch those exceptions and correct them. For the time being, you'd probably want to first check to make sure that the next token is what you expect it to be. Okay, so we've talked about how to get tokens and how to check for tokens. The scanner also has some convenient methods that allow us to read input as lines rather than as tokens, because often we want to read entire lines. And the two methods that we care about are next line, which returns a string, and has next line, which tells us whether there is another line of input. It returns false when we hit end of file. So this is going to allow us to read a line at a time, and then if we want to chop up this string that we've read, we can actually feed the string to a second scanner object, and through that mechanism break it up. So you would see a common program that reads lines looking something like this. You'd say scanner, say console equals new scanner, and you'd embed system.in. Then you might say something like while console.has next line, and you could then embed the line that you're going to read into a second scanner. So I could say scanner, say line tokenizer equals new scanner console.nextLine. And what this does, this part right here returns a string which I feed into the line tokenizer scanner, and now that scanner chops up the line and we can access it. So now we do our scanner processing, and then very important thing to do at the end is to close it. So line tokenizer dot close. And the close method is important because Java will not garbage collect a scanner object until you use the close method. If you forget to use the close method, you can see that if I had a very large set of input, I would end up having a large number of scanner objects that were lying around. I better put this brace here to show that it's being closed. So close is an important method. Use it as soon as you finish using a scanner so that Java can reclaim it. So these are the important set of methods that you have with a scanner. So these methods are line reading, okay, close for closing a scanner when you're done with it, and then the token getting methods and the token checking methods. So let's just take a look then at a full-length program for the scanner, and we're going to pretend that what we're going to do is be reading lines of input that have a name, an age, which should be an integer, and true if the person is male, false if they're a female. And what we want to do is we want to just type check it. We want to make sure there's 3 entries per line. We want to make sure the first one is a string, the second one is an int, the third one is a Boolean. Okay, so here's the sample file, and you can see that the first line is fine, but the second line is missing the gender. Third line's okay. The fourth line has an invalid entry for gender and so on. So let's just go down and see what the output should look like. So it says line 2 must have a field for singleness. You can see line 2 up here is missing that. Line 4, we can see right here, that should be a Boolean, and we entered an integer. You can see on line 5 we are missing the fields for age and singleness. Line 6, actually, even though 10 is not a name, we can't actually detect that because we're going to accept anything that's a string, but you can see that 30 is an invalid singleness attribute. Then on the next line, line 7, this true should be a integer. Line 8 is a blank line, and so it says must have the format name, age, singleness. Finally, line 9, we're saying that age should be an integer, and it is missing a field for singleness. So here's the complete program for accomplishing this task. So you see we've imported the scanner, and that the first thing we do is wrap system.in in a scanner object, and this time rather than putting the line tokenizer inside the loop, I put it outside the loop, and I have a variable for counting my lines so that I can print out meaningful line numbers. So this is the idiom for iterating through lines while console has next line. You can see I simply create a new scanner object and dump the next line into it, increment my line number, and now I go to work on each of my 3 fields. So here's the code for the first field. That's just checking to make sure that the line's not blank. Okay, so I'm checking to see that it has a next token. If it does, I simply consume it because it's supposed to be a string. If not, then I'm printing out an error message saying that in essence it's a blank line and you forgot to put anything. And you can see continuous, just like in C++, it allows us to go to the next iteration of the loop. Okay, this handles the processing for the second field. So that second field needs to be an integer, and the first thing we do is check to make sure it exists. If it doesn't exist, we're going to print out an error message saying that we have to have age and singleness fields. If it does exist, we want to check and make sure that it's a integer. And if it is, we simply consume that token by reading it as an int. Otherwise, we print out a message saying that age should be an integer. And finally, we do our checking for the third field to make sure it's a Boolean. We first check to make sure that the field exists, and if it doesn't, we print out an error message saying you forgot the singleness field. If it does exist, we check to make sure it's a Boolean, that is, it's either true or false. And if it does, we consume it. Otherwise, we print out a message saying it should be a Boolean, and we continue. And finally, you see right here at the bottom that we close the line tokenizer at the end of the loop. So each time at the top of the loop, you notice that we're getting a new scanner object. Finally, while the notes talk about the console class, I recommend you not use it. The console class is a bit easier as a way of getting input from the console, but it doesn't work in what we call non-application forms of Java, such as applets. It also doesn't work when you redirect input from a file, which is what the TA is going to be doing all the time in this course. So if the TA redirects input from a file, the console class does not exist. So I recommend you look at the notes, see what a console class is, but then use the scanner class in this in your homework assignments. So this concludes this video. Another video is going to go over how you do file I/O.